Welcome to In Touch. I'm Lucy Sondels. If you think there was only one paper in Wadsworth, well, you're wrong. Here to talk about the history of journalism in Wadsworth is David Rodich. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Lucy. You can imagine when a tragedy happens in the country today, like the fires out west or the earthquakes in California, the floods in the Midwest, or the terrible storms, the hurricanes down in Florida, the first instinct is to get in touch with loved ones, family members in that area to make sure that they're all right. And the phone lines are jammed for hours as that communication is attempted. You can imagine what occurred in the pioneer days when the settlers came west into the wilderness, and they were cut off for months or sometimes even a year or two at a time from their loved ones back home. And often there was no way in which they could receive word from those people. Of course, mail service did exist, but it was very slow during those days, bringing the mail into the wilderness. So they had to rely on pioneers who would make a trip back to the old homestead and then bring word of the family that they had left behind. The first newspapers that we had in this area, after Medina County was formed in 1818, even though it was the county seat, they actually didn't have a newspaper until 1832. Now, 1832 was early, but in as much as it was the county seat, it shows a slowness there to get a paper started. And that was a forerunner of what we now have, the Medina County Gazette, but at that time it was called the Constitutionist. And it's a direct antecedent of our current Medina County Gazette. Also in 1839, they formed the Akron Beacon, which is an ancestor of the Akron Beacon Journal that we receive today. But Wadsworth did not have a paper until much later, in fact, after the Civil War. And this was not as the result of some desire for knowledge on the part of the people of Wadsworth or some need to communicate, but rather it was because of a rather feisty man. I neglected to bring a better picture of him today, but this is a composite of the mayors of Wadsworth that was made for the centennial celebration in 1914. And just over on the right-hand side, we see the Reverend Mr. Thomas W. Browning. And Reverend Browning was the Methodist minister here in Wadsworth. He was also involved in several other enterprises. But he was secretary and sometimes president of an organization called the Medina County Farmers Insurance Company. This was also sometimes called the Ohio Farmers Insurance Company, but it had no relation to the company in Westfield. Now, you know how insurance people can be, how difficult they can be to get along with sometimes. And the Reverend Mr. Browning was no exception. And the insurance company held forth in an office on the south side of Broad Street, possibly where John Hanna's office is now.
Oh, how ironic.
Or next door in a room that was torn down and where Dr. Boyer's office is now. But right in that area, I believe, is where they held forth. And it was necessary for them to go to Akron, to the Akron Beacon that I mentioned a moment ago, to have all of the forms that they needed printed for their insurance company. And Reverend Browning came to a dispute with Samuel Lane, who was the veteran editor of the Beacon. Reverend Browning was described by Wallace Root as being as pompous behind his desk as an Oriental demagogue. So I don't know if being Methodist had anything to do with it or not. Maybe it's just one of the traits I picked up. But he decided that he was going to do his own printing. And so he hired a man named George Root. Now, the Root family was very prominent in Medina. We think of Roots as being connected with the bee industry in Medina, which is true. This was another family, part of the same family, that lived in Sharon, and they were very early settlers of Sharon Township. And he hired George Root to go to Cincinnati and purchase printing equipment with the idea that George Root would pay for this on a payment basis, time payment basis, and he would own the equipment and do the printing for the insurance company. George Root returned with the equipment in 1865 and then enticed his brother, Wallace Root, who was working then as a printer for the Akron Beacon, for Sam Lane, to come over and put the equipment together. And this was done in, start with our pictures. Again, I neglected to bring a better picture of this. I think I'm going to be making a lot of apologies before we're done. The top up here, we see the old stone store, which was on the southeast corner of the square. And this had been begun, if you remember, we talked previously about the Pardees having brought the first mercantile business to the center of Wadsworth. They were on the northeast corner where picket fence is, and then in 1830 they built this old stone store on the southeast corner. It sat a little bit back from the corner here. This would be Main Street going down this direction and College Street going in front of the store. And the second floor of the store had been previously used by the Pardee brothers' brother, Dr. Pardee, as the beginning of his medical college before he built a specific medical college where the newer portion of the library parking lot stands on the corner of Lime and Broad. They moved this printing equipment into this vacant room, and Wallace Root arrived on the 22nd of January, 1866, and began assembling this printing press. Now this room, even though it was a fairly good-sized room, could barely contain this large press, and it was necessary when the press was operated to close the door because they had to swing a large crank, and they practically had to jump up in the air and then come down around. If you can imagine the way they used to crank old-style cars. And sometimes if you didn't, especially if a child, my father used to tell stories about trying to crank my grandfather's car when he was a very little boy, and sometimes it would spring back and knock him flying. Well, this was the same way with this printing press. It took two men standing on this handle, and they would jump up in the air to swing this big press around.
And that was to make each print.
To make each one. Each one had to be done separately, and of course all the type had to be set by hand. And they had to close the door in order to do this because they could not, there wasn't enough room for them to operate. And he had this done, and the first business, the first item that was printed was on the 24th of January, 1866, and it was for the insurance company. And Wallace Root decided that this was a pretty auspicious occasion, historically speaking. And so he made a very loud announcement out the window onto the streets of Wadsworth, "Hear ye, the first type is set." And he put it in his composing stick, and that was the first type ever set here in Wadsworth. The enterprise was so successful that by mid-March they had nearly paid off their entire investment. So this gave rise to Brother George's idea that he had held for a long time, that he wanted to have his own newspaper. And he'd even selected a name in childhood that he had wanted to place on his someday paper, and that was the name of the enterprise. But he needed an editor. And so he went about searching for an editor, and he found this man, John A. Clark, on what was said to be the lonesomest road in Guilford Township. Clark was a farmer and a school teacher, and it said that he was more interested in cultivating ideas than his crops. And so he eagerly accepted this idea of editing this new newspaper. So he moved his family to Wadsworth on the 22nd of April, 1866. And then just barely a month later, about 2 weeks later, on the 5th of May, 1866, the first edition of the Wadsworth Enterprise rolled off the presses. Now, this isn't the first edition of the Enterprise, but it's an early one. This is November 7th, 1867. And we were remarking before we began recording the quality of the paper. It's just excellent because it has a very high rag content. And these are in an excellent state of preservation, whereas some of the later papers, which had a very high acid content, literally self-destruct. Like a lot of the photographs and things that we have today, they have a very high acid content and they self-destruct. But they have the train schedules here. They have lists of the different physicians and business houses in town. Most of the early papers did not have much local information on the front page. Local information was found inside. Of course, going out of town was a big deal in that day. Going to rivers. In fact, if you look at the newspapers even after the turn of the century, up into the 1920s or so, if a family went to visit somebody in River Styx on a Sunday afternoon, that was a big event. Or if someone went to Akron and spent the day, that was noteworthy at that time. It's been said that on one of the edition of the Enterprise, there was a triple homicide in Cleveland that was put on the back pages, but a remedy for getting rid of a pest for corn crops was listed on the front page. But the paper was very successful from the start. Now, I don't know exactly why, but George Root, even though this was fulfilling his childhood dream of having a newspaper, dropped out of the newspaper shortly thereafter. Now, Clark, that we talked about a moment ago, was very successful here in town. He was our first superintendent of schools in 1870. He was the clerk and registrar for the village. He was also a township trustee.
All this is his editor also?
Yes, and he was mayor of Wadsworth. They said that to him, an editor's tripod, according to Wallace Root, an editor's tripod was greater than a throne. Peter Cherry, who is the historian, he's someone we'll introduce at this point, I guess, because we're going to be talking about him a lot. A lot of these pictures that we'll be showing today, we have seen on previous shows, and I think that's something we should point out now, that the reason these pictures are coming up again is because the newspaper is reflective of the community, and it has encapsulated or captured the history of the community through the years. Now, Peter Cherry was also from Sharon. He was lame as a child and had a kind of a difficult childhood. He was part of a large family. His father was reputed to be heir to an English earldom. Oh. And word of this had been received, and the father left the family in Sharon to travel to England to claim the fortune and the earldom. But he got about as far as New York and about ready to board the boat, and he was so homesick for his family and missed them so dearly that he returned to Sharon, never followed through on any of these claims. Peter Cherry had been a school teacher and also became a historian in this area, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. He described John Clark, he says, John Clark was dark complexioned with jet black hair, black mustache, and a high broad forehead. He had a plug hat, a long-tailed coat, limp cane, and a short black pipe emitting clouds of smoke. He had jet black eyes and heavy lips, yet on the whole, the expression on his face was pleasing. Now, Mr. Clark was a great temperance man and fought against saloons in Wadsworth, which were plentiful even in that day. And one of the main sources, one of the main outlets for purchasing liquor was that old stone store that we showed a moment ago. And he railed against this in his editorials, that this ought to be stopped and that they should no longer do this. Well, when Mr. Clark became mayor of Wadsworth, the idea was put forth that they ought to widen Main Street. They ought to move the left side of Main Street back far enough so that it would correspond or be parallel to the west side of High Street. And so we'd have a true square downtown. But in order to do this, he had to get the easement of the property owners, including the owners of the old stone store who owned the corner property. Well, they weren't about to give in to him after the editorials he had written against them. Consequently, Wadsworth Square is not square. One of the, I think I'm getting ahead of myself on that. As I said, George Root dropped out after just about a year of partnership with John Clark in the newspaper. John Clark owned it entirely. Then he took in another partner named Emmanuel Lowry. And Lowry only stayed a few months and then he left. So John Clark again owned the paper entirely by himself. By this time they'd moved around the corner into a room above Beck's shoe store. And this would be above the area where the martial arts school is now, or what used to be the city loan office. It was upstairs of that building where the newspaper was located, and it was still called the Enterprise. Now, at this same time, and I'm not going to go into great deal of detail about this because we have talked about George Bennett in the past, but at this time in Sharon Center, there was a young man named George Bennett, and George Bennett had been treated cruelly as a child by his peers. He'd been teased, kind of the laughing stock of the community, and he vowed that he was going to make a great financial success of himself to get back at all of these people. Through some strange maneuvering, he managed to get some capital with which to start a paper and a little yeller shanty on his father's farm at Clark's Corners that was called the Young Folks' Gem. And there wasn't anything especially literary about the paper. It wasn't any great literary gem. But what he did start with that paper was the premium system. He's been quoted or been called the originator of the premium system in this country. That is to say that he would start gem clubs, and boys and girls would go out and sell so many subscriptions to the paper. And for so many subscriptions sold, they would receive a prize. One of the favorites mentioned was a 6-shooter. All the boys wanted to be like Kit Carson. What they got was a pop gun with 6 corks tied to it. Or a beautiful golden watch. He failed to mention it didn't have any workings inside of it. But this paper flourished. It was printed in every state that then existed in the Union. As far away as Australia, this could be found. The subscription list grew to at least 250,000. Some reports take it as high as 400,000. And obviously the little printing company in Sharon could no longer handle this. So he had it done down at John Clark's Enterprise office. Well, it was, we have a picture here of the staff of George Bennett's Young Folks Gem. It began in the fall of 1871 and 2. George Bennett's over on the left-hand side, and his staff with him. And it was necessary for John Clark to increase the size of his printing house because of this. He bought 2 properties across the street. One house he retained for himself and moved to Broad Street. The other house belonged to Captain T.D. Woolbaugh, our photographer. And this house was moved up to the corner of High and Boyer Street, where it still stands, and is now the home of Hartman Studios, owned by Bob Durhammer. Now, this is a photograph, or I should say a photograph, but it's a copy of an etching that appeared in the 1874 Medina County Atlas, which shows the Young Folks Gem building. And one thing that you'll note about it, this building is only 2 stories high. And that's because when the Atlas went to press in 1874, that was the intention, to build it 2 stories high. However, that wonderful benefactor, Reverend Browning, liked to boast that he was the one who talked John Clark into building the building 3 stories high. And this building would now be Bartlett Cook Flowers on the ground floor, the south room of the American Legion building. Now, as I said, the paper flourished. This building, the steam printing house that he built, was 3 stories high, had a basement with steam elevators running to all floors and steam speaking tubes. And it was, the presses ran night and day all month long in order to grind out this tremendous edition to send to all these people around the country. As I said, we visited George Bennett's grave previously, and we've told his story here. We've shown some of the Currier and Ives prints that were given out as premiums. So I'm not going to go through all that again, but I will just quickly read Peter Cherry, to whom I referred a moment ago, was hired by Bennett. Bennett had been one of his students, had been hired by Bennett as his bookkeeper. And Wallace Root, the man who assembled the press, was hired as the writer for the paper. What little bit was written, most of it was contributed. But this is how Peter Cherry describes George Bennett. Bennett was a power unto himself. He had no companions, no confidants. He was not generous or sympathetic. He was self-centered, courageous, venturesome. He had no education, was ignorant, and was self-conceited. He was a thorough believer in advertising and printer's ink. He was not modest. On the contrary, he had the cheek of a government mule. He was the most secret of men and yet the most open. He had no literary attainment and could not write 3 consecutive lines of editorial or advertising. His word was as good as another man's bond, yet he would rob you as cheerfully as if he were doing a good act. He was a man of great contradictions and a man of humor. He was one of the greatest powers of good and evil I ever saw. He never made any promises that he didn't keep, unless they were made in printer's ink. And for those who saw our visit to the Western Star Cemetery, they remember that we visited George Bennett's grave. He fell ill in the spring of 1874 with pneumonia, was confined to his bed and delirious. Towards the end, he stood up in bed, reached out his hands, called for his mother, and fell back dead. While he had been delirious, his great fortune had disappeared. A steamer trunk that was 4 by 4 feet by 4 feet, 4 by 4 by 4 trunk had been filled with money. And in order for his employees to get the last day's receipts in, they had to get in and jump up and down on the money to mash it down so they could close the lid. That and the contents of a safe, all of his diamonds, stick pins, and other valuables disappeared during his illness. And there were many stories told about that. His employees took him out and laid him next to his father and mother in the Western Star Cemetery. But rumor was that he was not happy where his employees had laid him, and he was seen to walk at nights in the God's acre in which he had his ground.
He might have been looking for his treasure.
He may well have. In 1964, when Eleanor Shapiro wrote her Wadsworth Heritage, she noted, "In recent years, George Bennett's large white tombstone has been knocked down by marauders of this country cemetery, unmindful of the reported threats of George Bennett's ghosts." And one of the things I did about 20 years ago was to have Mr. Bennett's stone uprighted, and there was a section of it that had been lost in another part of the cemetery, and that was put back together. And so hopefully he rests a little
He won't haunt you, huh? You're a friend.
Hopefully not. After Bennett's death, John Clark bought the newspaper, the Young Folks Gem, which he ran in conjunction with the Wadsworth Enterprise. Unfortunately, Mr. Clark tried to run the Young Folks Gem honestly, and it ruined him. And that's one of the problems that he had in having built this big house, steam printing house. If he had left it at 2 stories, he probably would have been all right. But Reverend Browning's urging that he extend it to the 3rd story was really his undoing. He was quite a large property owner at the time, and most of this went to sheriff's sale. And in 1880, he sold the business to a man named George Digley. But a short time later, apparently Digley was either unsatisfied or unable to make the payments. And it was necessary for Mr. Clark to take the paper over again. I should mention, after he lost the steam printing house, he moved back across the street above Beck's shoe store, above what we would call the City Loan Building. A couple little things here. This is for only $1, you can buy the Wadsworth Enterprise for the balance of 1984 to January of 1985, and it lists all the terms in the different places around town. These are some of the different storekeepers from whom you could subscribe for the paper. And it just a flyer, one of those things we talked about before, a piece of ephemera, something that's normally thrown away that advertised the paper. On the back is a sample copy of the paper. Now, the side that's out isn't dated, but I can tell you it's 1887. And the way I know that is because in the corner up here, they give a subscription, by the way, at that time. Our circulation 628, which they figure is about 3,600 readers. So apparently the paper, after you bought the paper, it got passed around a great deal. But we've talked before about Mr. McGregor, the school teacher of the Octagonal Academy, whose former students, having attained success in life, built a monument to him, a life-size monument in our Woodlawn Cemetery. And this is the McGregor Monument Fund, and it was giving a update on how much money had been collected. That drive was run by was headed by Milton Henry, who was an uncle to Laura Spellman Rockefeller, Mrs. John D. Rockefeller, who we've said before was born in Wadsworth, and Mr. Henry had been one of Mr. McGregor's pupils. The next photograph we have shows the dedication of that monument in 1887, the McGregor Monument. And the reason I bring it along when we're talking about newspapers is because just out of the corner here, you can't really see it on camera, but there's a fellow in a white beard, and that's Aaron Pardee, the first mayor of town. And next to him, the fellow in the black beard and plug hat, like the description said, is John Clark. Now, an interesting thing about this is an original photograph from the time. It's on Captain Woolbaugh's card. It has his name and the address down on the side. And I figured that's as good as it's going to get as far as an original photograph. What I did not realize was that it's not all of the photograph. I got another copy from a member of the Hilliard family a few years ago, and there's actually about 3 or 4 people standing to the right of Mr. Clark. But in any case, he was very, very active in the community even at that time. Now, in 1880, I should have a few publications here. Among the other things that Mr. Clark did during his ownership of the paper was the publishing of Wadsworth's first history, the first history devoted entirely to Wadsworth, which is the Wadsworth Memorial, which was printed in 1875. This, as we've talked before, is an outgrowth of Wadsworth Pioneer Celebration, when the Reverend Mr. Edward Brown suggested that pioneer settlers be invited back to their old homestead to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the community. It was also decided that all of the proceedings of the celebration be written down and published in book form together with a history of the community and a genealogy of some of the prominent families. A year after the celebration, Mr. Brown was called to Wadsworth. He was living in Iowa, and he was called to Wadsworth to assume the pastorate of the Congregationalist Church, and found that nothing had been done towards writing down this history. So he took it upon himself to do so, and it is to him that we are indebted because it's very, very accurate. The genealogical section particularly is very accurate. But once the book was printed, by this time Mr. Brown had moved on to another pastorate, and nobody claimed the books. And Clark was there was another liability with which he was faced. So he was left to giving them away free with a subscription to the paper, just anything to get rid of the books. And another thing that he published were the rules and regulations of the Wadsworth Village Cemetery in 1878. And it gives a history of our cemetery and neighboring cemeteries like the Town Line or Western Star Cemetery that we visited. And then in the back it has a list of all the people who were buried in the cemetery, our cemetery, up until that time. Now this year we are in the process, I'm working with the cemetery board to update a booklet that can be given out to lot owners. Now this one is crumbling. I should have brought a better copy of it. This is another thing. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll hold off on that for just a moment. I'm sorry. We can go on to the next picture. Now in 1885, a rival to the enterprise was started by this man, seated right here, James E. Corey. And he founded what was called, this is a picture of the Oddfellows officer, but I didn't have a good picture of Mr. Corey. And he was a member of the Oddfellows Lodge. But in 1885, he founded the Wadsworth Banner newspaper. And that was, really gave John Clark a run for his money, you might say, as far as the paper was concerned.
Do you speculate political differences or opinions or money to be made in newspapers spurred him on, Mr. Corey?
I think so. I think he had previous experience, and he was successful here. Some of these newspapers that we'll talk about in a minute did not last as long. And but Mr. Corey came in 1885, and as we'll see, he lasted a while.
Oh, I guess because the name is still with us.
Banner.
Banner, not Corey.
We'll get it yet. Now this picture is this is a picture of the Huntsberger block shortly after it was constructed. Many people would refer to it as the Ladrack building, or it's now owned by Bob Guthrie, Dr. Bob Guthrie, who has his dental offices on the first floor. This was built in 1885 by W.B. Huntsberger, son of Reverend Ephraim Huntsberger, founder of the Mennonite Church here in Wadsworth. He had a boot and shoe store in a frame building on the same location, and he built this brick building and reserved the center room for his shoe store. He is seated on the left, and his partner, Morgan Neath, who was well known to many Wadsworth people, is on the right. The north room was the Freeborn's clothing house, Freeborn in Beardsley, and the south room at that time could have been a cigar store or a confectionery, and I believe the man in the white hair on the porch is Aaron Pardee, the first mayor. But the reason I point this out is you can see the sign up above, the Wadsworth Enterprise. By this time they had moved back across the street, this time above the Huntsberger block, and probably can't make it out on camera, but John Clark is sitting in the window.
Oh my heavens.
At that time.
Yeah. Excellent eyesight.
Now, you would think moving all this printing equipment back and forth, these old heavy presses, would have been quite a chore, but they seem to do it with some regularity, because in the next picture, you see again they're back across the street. Now this is a picture we've seen before, a rally for William McKinley, held in front of Knopf Brothers jewelry shop, where Central Shoe Repair is now on Main Street. And next door, where the boot and shoe store is, you just make out upstairs, the last part of Prize.
Yeah.
So the Enterprise was back there in 1896. So they're back and forth across the street. Now, sometime in the late 1880s, early 1890s, this man came to town William J. Swisher. And Mr. Swisher bought the banner, Wadsworth banner, that Mr. Corey had started in 1885. And then in 1891, he purchased the Wadsworth Enterprise from John Clark and had the Wadsworth Enterprise and banner. And Mr. Swisher and his family lived in a double house at that time, just north of the carriage works on High Street. Now, this double house to which I refer would be what is now Fixler's Agency.
Okay.
And you'll see a lot of tie-ins here with the different names as we move along. Back up just a second.
Okay.
During Mr. Swisher's time here, one of the first things he did, this is the Wadsworth Public Schools, and it's rules and regulations, course of study.
Okay.
I should have brought a better copy, I suppose. At least we won't feel so bad if this one falls apart.
Or I won't feel so bad.
This is for the years 1888,
Okay, on the side
92, and it gives there's a picture of the school that was designed in 1869 by Simeon Humphrey, the Union School.
And just some of the,
That's
it's a class of 1892.
it's a list of the class
Right.
members in there.
Rules and regulations.
And he also published the second directory of Wadsworth. I didn't bring the first one.
Well, there's a second one, so we know there was a first.
My heavens, John Clark published the first directory of Wadsworth in 1870. It's really nice. I'll show it to you sometime. This is the second one in 1894, which is a history of the town, a little capsule history, a lot of advertising, and of course a list of the people.
This must be a great help to you when you're trying to figure out what stores are where and which businesses
Well,
are
it is
by
to a
whom.
certain degree, but in a lot of cases they'll say 2 doors north of the post office, or buy
It's all
Johnson's
relative,
bread
huh?
at the same old stand, or next to this person, or 2 doors. So sometimes it helps and sometimes it doesn't. Now, we also had some other newspapers that were published during the same time.
Were these weekly papers, monthly papers?
Yes, almost all weekly. There was no daily paper. Now, I didn't get that in a frame, but this is a picture of the sheep sheds.
The sheep.
It was called the sheep shed. The rumors used to circulate that it was called the sheep sheds because sheep were put there before being taken to market, but that's really not true. They just were called that because there was rather an unattractive set of 5 storerooms that were on the northwest corner of the square where Accurate is now. The old hotel had burned down in 1875, and other than a log cabin during the Harrison campaign in '88, there was nothing there until Dr. Kramer had a small dental office on the corner that later became the office of Dr. M.F. Miller on the east side of High Street. It was moved across High Street where Huntington Bank is now. But these 5 rooms were built there in 1895, and even though they were ridiculed, they were always full. And one contained a saloon, and one contained J. Bissell's barbershop, and another one contained a restaurant. And then there was the Wadsworth News newspaper. Now, the Wadsworth News newspaper had no relationship with the Wadsworth News that later merged with the Banner Press, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. This was a separate paper and was rather short-lived. Among some of the other papers that we had, and these are so brittle, we're rather hesitant to open them up.
Okay, maybe I can just switch or hold.
If you
Well, maybe if I, do you want me just to switch it from the Wadsworth?
if you want to,
Okay, I
that's
think
the
I'll do it this
Wadsworth.
way. Right, so I'm going to switch this now, the Wadsworth Times.
That's the Wadsworth Times. It was begun in 1904 by Frank Hard. And this is the Wadsworth Advance
The Wadsworth Advance.
by Thomas Deary in 1884. Phew.
Okay, this one is entitled A Family Paper. We Work for the Interests of Wadsworth.
But none of these lasted very long. There were several others, the Wadsworth Advance, the Register, the News, the Times. but none of them lasted very long, maybe some of them a year at the most. And then, so Wadsworth was left with just the one paper. Mr. Swisher dropped the name of the enterprise and just called his paper the Banner. And he was very successful with this from about 1891 until 1905. And at that time, a man came to, in 1905, a competitor, Mr. Swift, started the Wadsworth Press. And this is one of the publications, W.H. Swift and Company. This is the directory of Wadsworth in 1905. You can see at that time what we would call the accurate building was just, that's just an artist rendering. It was just in the planning stages. And he started the Wadsworth Press in that year.
Okay, I'll show the outside of this book too. There's the directory. Okay.
Now, Mr. Swift operated this for about a year or a year and a half. And at that time, E.A. Day and Company came to town and they purchased the goodwill and the subscription list of the Wadsworth Banner from Mr. Swisher. This was in spring of 1906. And they published the subscription list and goodwill and the equipment from Mr. Swift, and combined these two papers together to form the Banner Press.
Okay.
Now, this only lasted for about a year and a half when Mr. Day gave this up. And I should back up a moment. I wanted to introduce somebody that we've talked about before, and that's Nellie Harder, who was a descendant of pioneers through the Harders and the Longs and the Peters and the Everhards and the Razors. This is her graduation picture in 1903 from Wadsworth High School. And after being graduated from Wadsworth High School, like most young women, she went to school teaching, and she taught at the Stony Ridge School out on Reimer Road, what we now call Reimer Road, used to be called Stony Ridge Road. And this is a little souvenir that she gave her students.
Start with the picture here on the front.
For that school year, and it listed, they called it Vacation Ridge. That was district number 2 in a list of the pupils. But she decided school teaching was not for her. And so the following year, in 1904, she went to work for Mr. Swisher at the Wadsworth Banner, and seemed very happy in that work. Worked in the office there, and then later picked up other duties along the way. But after E.A. Day and Company bought the Banner and combined it with the press, there were some hard feelings there, and apparently the Days were not the best people to work for. And so she left Wadsworth and went to work at the Barberton Telegram and remained there a year until October of 1907, when W.S. Hostetler came to Wadsworth. Mr. Hostetler had a previous connection with Wadsworth. The old Wadsworth News that I mentioned ago, he had edited for about a year before going to New York and working on some newspapers there. He came back to this area and worked in Doylestown. He had previously, I guess I'm getting myself all out of order here. After being graduated from the Doylestown High School, he was born near Doylestown. After being graduated from that high school, Mr. Hostetler taught journalism right out of high school, and then at the age of 18 became publisher of the Doylestown newspaper, and also published a paper in Canal Fulton. That's before he came to Wadsworth, then went to New York, then returned to Doylestown. And this paper is dated March 21st, 1904. And at that time, he was the publisher of the Doylestown Journal.
Okay.
Then in October of 1907, he came to Wadsworth and bought out the Day Company. And perhaps she had known him during his previous time in Wadsworth, but Nellie felt comfortable enough to return to Wadsworth and go back to work for the company. At that time, the Banner Press, as I said, Mr. Day had combined the two papers and into the press's offices, which were in the Reimer block, up above what we would now call Love's Country Market.
Oh, okay.
And this is the crew getting some fresh air in a day about in 1907, early 1908. And on the left you have Ann Showers, and Fern Hall Abrams and Emma Days Kaufman and Nellie Harder and Harold Long. And I imagine as hot as it must have got up there printing papers with the presses running and everything else and the clothes they had to wear, they were thankful for a good breeze coming in that day. Now Mr. Hostetler was not a vain man or an unduly proud man, but he did have a love besides his wife. In Hilliard and Curry one day, Hilliard and Curry Furniture and Undertaking, which is where Holmesbrook Hardware is now, next to Accurate, he spotted a roll-top desk and swivel chair. And he knew he had to have this roll-top desk and swivel chair. And he bought it on the spot. The only problem was they couldn't figure out a way to get it to the second floor of that building to the newspaper. Not to be undone, Mr. Hostetler moved the newspaper to a building on
that would accommodate this.
On Broad Street. Look at the top one here.
The top photo.
This building that's now occupied by Charlie Goose's Napa Auto Parts on Broad Street, next to the Marathon, had been built in 1908 as an automotive garage. And as far as I know, it was never used for that purpose, but that's what it was built for. It was built by W.H. Baker, who was our local legendary stonemason and who crafted the beautiful stone bandstand that once graced our square. In any case, Mr. Hostetler moved the newspaper into there in 1909, and it had a reinforced concrete floor, and it would support his desk and chair. The center picture, we see some of the ladies with Nellie Harder, the other lady standing outside. And I suppose it did get hot in those days because we see the bottom one there. There's the same ladies outside cafe and bar. Actually, I put that in there purposely out of order because they weren't stopping by for a cool one after a long day. Actually, the previous building we had shown, the one that's Love's Market now, if you can imagine going into Love's store, it's an ample-sized room for their store, but that was originally 2 storerooms. And I would think that would have been kind of cramped, but they had a piano store on one side and a saloon on the other until our drinking was outlawed in Wadsworth. Legal drinking was outlawed in Wadsworth about 12 years before Prohibition. So those ladies were just taking a rest, that's all. Now this picture, after they had moved into that new building, this picture Nellie had taken because she was going to have a dinner party, and this was sometime between 1915 and 1920. And she purposely had the photographer place the employees far enough apart so that she could take a print of the picture and cut out the faces and use them on place cards. On the left we have Hugo Paradin and Leota Pollock, who was later Mrs. C.C. Fixler, the mother of Tom Fixler, Ann Showers, Laura Jordan, W.H. Hostetler. Now, I could have brought a number of pictures of Mr. Hostetler, the editor. You notice he's got a fedora on there. I've got ones where he's out hunting and he's got a kind of a fur hat on, all these. It wasn't until I was sent a photograph of him in just a suit, a more formal photograph, that I realized he was bald, completely bald.
Hence the hat.
I guess. Didn't want to get a head cold. Nellie Harder and Hazel Farnsworth, and on the end is a person very familiar to Wadsworth people, Worth Westenbarger, who worked in the newspaper at that time. And then we have some interior pictures, and because they're on the same type of stock, card backing or card stock, I assume they were all taken the same day. But these are some interior pictures of the newspaper at that time when it was at its Broad Street location, the Wadsworth Banner Press.
Okay. Shall I keep showing them in
Sure.
succession? Okay.
There's a picture of the presses.
They were monstrous, weren't they?
Yes, and they were the newest in their day.
Okay. Pull the next one up here.
Now that's the office.
Now, is this the famous desk and chair?
Well, now,
here? Of course, how would we know?
Miss Harder later had the desk in her home, and I later had the chair, which I lost. And it seemed to me his desk was bigger than that, so I'm not really certain if that's the same one or not. That's probably her hat. It looks like something she would have worn. but you can see all the pigeonholes back there and all of that.
Well, these are great photographs.
Now this one I brought, most people remember Miss Harder as she looked in the opening scenes that we saw today when she received her award that we'll talk about in a minute, when she was more of a middle-aged woman. And so I try to bring some younger pictures to show that she was a girl at one time. Now this picture was taken
Beautiful
probably
girl.
about 1912, and notice the elaborate dress. I would guess that this picture was not taken by Captain Woolbaugh, but by a photographer we had in town who was up above the new part of Anschutz's building, and his name was Weed, W-E-E-D, and he took pictures here basically in 1911, 12, and 13. Normally he signed his photographs. I don't see that that one's signed, but that's the style that he used in taking his pictures.
Very pretty girl.
Now, Mr. Hostetler, I joked a minute ago about his having another love, pardon me, but actually he was a very devoted family man. And he and his wife had a home here in Wadsworth, of course, and then in about 1920, they built a new home on the corner of Broad Street and Humboldt Avenue. Now, if you remember when I hope somebody's seen some of our shows before, when we visited that area, and I explained that the area of Humboldt Avenue and Fairview Avenue was referred to as the Heights, because that was considered so far and up and away from Wadsworth. And he built the house on the corner that's now used, I believe, for the older daycare. Are they still there, I believe?
I'm not really sure.
I believe they are still there, next to the convent, but it's on the corner. Most people will think of that as the Joe Bender home, because Joe and Katie Bender lived there for a number of years. But previous to the Bender's ownership, it had belonged to Warner Williard, who was president of the Wadsworth Lumber Company, and previous to that it belonged to Harry Mensch, who owned the service station downtown. But it was originally built by Mr. Hostetler and his wife, about 1920, as I say, and Reynold Hinsdale was the architect, and he is the same architect who built Grace Lutheran Church. And it's a beautiful home, though it's been remodeled through the years. The Hostetlers had two daughters, Kathleen and Eleanor, and they were both born with a birth defect and suffered a number of illnesses through childhood, particularly Eleanor, though both of them were very talented, very charming young women. In 1922, tragedy befell the family. This really, I guess nothing would show up of this on the screen, but on the same day, on March of 1922, at 5:30 in the morning, Nellie Harder's mother, who had lived with her and had fallen downstairs and had received a brain injury and had been lingering for some time, died. And at 3:30 that afternoon, Eleanor Hostetler, who had scarlet fever and then appendicitis, and then bowel obstructions began, and just one thing after another for this poor child who had suffered so through most of her life. And they both died on the same day. So it's, the newspaper, you really can't pick it up on there, but you can probably see the black border, and it gives a rather detailed account of their passing. And it was quite a blow to the Hostetlers, as well as to Nellie, who was very devoted to her mother.
Yeah, I wanted to get the Wadsworth banner press for the entire.
50 cents per year, payable, or $1.50 a year, payable in advance.
Seeing the black border. Oh, how sad.
Now, I should say that Kathleen did survive her sister, though this was quite a blow to her because the daughters were inseparable. Eleanor, I should mention, was only 15 at the time. This is a picture of Kathleen bursting through an issue of the banner press. But she later went on and was educated as a librarian, and was a librarian in Seville for many years. And later in life, she continued to live with her mother, Mrs. Hostetler, who had relocated on Highland Avenue. And later in life, Kathleen was married to Ben Hilliard, one of the 6 sons of Undertaker J.B. Hilliard. And Ben had been blinded at a young age and worked as an interpreter for the blind and in translating books into Braille. And so they had that kind of educational background, both of them. And they lived happily together for quite a number of years until their death. Now, this is just memorial program, an obsequy that was put out at the time of Mr. Hostetler. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself again. As I said, this was quite a blow to Mr. Hostetler. And in 1929, in May, he also died. His health had been failing for some time, and they said that the loss of this daughter was probably one of the principal causes. And this is one of the little commemorative booklets that we've talked about before that's put out at the time when, that was put out when someone died in those days. And that's a card that was sent out. And I meant to bring a window card also. The businesses all closed in town, and there was a large card that was placed in the window. If you can make that out or not, it says, "It is with profound sorrow that the Wadsworth Banner Press announces the death of its editor and senior member of the firm, Walter S. Hostetler." So at that time, Nellie, in 1922, some of the big town newspapers, even as far away as New York, were trying to lure Nellie away to work for them, and Mr. Hostetler decided he better put those ideas out of her head. So he sold her a quarter interest in the paper, so she actually was a partner. And in 1929, his ownership, his part of the ownership passed to his wife and daughter, Kathleen, and Nellie continued to operate the paper with them until 1934, when she became the sole owner of the paper. Now, in 1925, another paper was started in Wadsworth, and this was called the Wadsworth News. Now, this has no relation to the Wadsworth News I mentioned as having been in the sheep sheds in the 1890s. And this started as a supermarket shoppers type paper. In a back room, this is the old Isley's store that later became Wyworth's and then Amago's. And it was in the back room of that store that James Gillespie in 1925 started the Wadsworth News. There was a, as I say, had no connection to the other paper. Now, shortly after that, a man named E.D. Simmons purchased the paper.
The News?
Yes. Yeah. With Raymond Hyde as manager and editor.
Nope.
Not quite. I thought I was organized. I'm not. As the editor of the paper, Raymond Hyde is manager and editor of the paper. And he eventually became an owner of the paper. And in 1928, it was incorporated with a number of people, prominent people here in Wadsworth, as partners in the paper. It was a Republican weekly. It had Don Williams as the president and general manager. Mr. Hyde continued as the vice president and editor. Dr. Homer Baldwin, who was our state representative, was the treasurer of the paper, and Charles Knapp was the secretary of the paper. And later that fall, they moved to Wautroosa, to the building where Banner Printing is located now. And then in 1939, they constructed a special building across the street on the east side of Wautroosa and moved there. We've got a couple more as we can show here. During the years that Nellie Harder ran the paper, the Wadsworth Banner Press, that's a menu. It's a comical menu that that probably would only make sense to printers, but it begins with things like gasoline cocktail and 9-point linotype slugs, and it goes through, and it was for one of the dinners that was given. But you'd probably have to be a in fact, an old-time newspaper person at that to understand that. These were blotters, were something that was used frequently in business, and these are 2 issues of the Banner Press Junior that were put out in February and in April of 1930, and they just give general newsy news about town, and of course they've got a calendar for the month down on the bottom, and they were used as a blotter. Another blotter was this one for the NRA, the National Recovery Act. We do our part, and most businesses and had in town the NRA sticker in there. Another one of President Roosevelt's alphabet soup organizations. Now, in 1939, Wadsworth, in fact, probably be best if I just handed them to you one by one. Take a look at some of the newspapers, the way they appeared in those days. This is a copy of the Wadsworth News from October 30th, 1930. Now you see by that time they had changed from a shopper's tabloid into a regular full-fledged newspaper. Here's a last of murder charges nulled, had to do with a murder that happened here in Wadsworth. Big crowd attends Legion safety dinner, campaigns to end at polls Tuesday. There's some political cartoons, a lot of things pertaining to the election. City on toes for Halloween party. Party leader dies on eve of election. Now that refers to Dr. Kramer that we've talked about before, who was a political leader here in the state of Ohio, and was a dentist here in Wadsworth and a mayor previous to the turn of the century. But to give some idea of the number of items that were covered.
And illustrations, too.
Yes. Now, this is a picture of the Wadsworth Banner Press staff out in front of that Broad Street facility at the time of Wadsworth's 125th anniversary celebration in 1939. And Miss Harder posed with the different members of her staff at that time. Tony Michael, who came in 1929, A.J. Michael, as the associate editor and the advertising manager, also had the task of taking all the photographs. Up till that time, a photograph in the newspaper was very, very rare because it was a complicated process and very costly. But after about 1930, photographs began to appear with more regularity, and it was Mr. Michael's responsibility in most cases to take those photographs. And it was when I received his collection of negatives and prints that we get a lot of these photographs that we're able to use on our show. Now, sometimes I slip and I refer to her as Nellie. I get very familiar because I feel like we're just old-time chums. I never called her that in person. And I tell you, I received a Christmas card and letter from Tony Michael at Christmas time. He's 87 now, and his eyesight is not as good as it was, so he can't write as often. But he and his wife are very active in retirement. But he still refers to her after all these years as Miss Harder. I've never seen him refer to her as Nellie. But I remember the first time I went to call on her as a little boy to question her. And the housekeeper answered the door, and I asked if I could speak with Mrs. Harder. And the housekeeper drew back, and she said, "That's Miss Harder." I learned my lesson right then and there.
And now you're calling her Nellie.
I hope she doesn't mind. But then we have some other pictures show the inside. The press is running inside the newspaper.
Getting more modern looking. Do you want the outside of the building?
Sure.
Okay. I'm going to switch here to the outside.
This shows the building as it was decorated for that celebration, 1939. You can see all the banners and bunting and some historical pictures that I'd probably love to have right there.
I bet you have them.
We can go through those.
Should we just go through these?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is a picture of Catherine Warnerwick, who was a Wadsworth girl who worked for Nellie for many years in the office there. Prior to her marriage, she married a minister whose last name was Kruger, whose first name escapes me, but she's at work there at her desk. And her father ran a car agency on South Pardee Street, if you can imagine a car agency being on South Pardee. Because in those days, of course, you didn't have the big lots as they do now. You had maybe 1 or 2 cars at the most, and then people ordered. We talked before about some of the publications that were put out by the paper during the different ownerships. One that we overlooked was this. This is the Wadsworth Directory for 1913, which was published by the Wadsworth Banner Press.
There.
And then, of course, this book we've shown many times. It's very important to the history of our community. Wadsworth Center to City, that was written by the class of 1938 with the assistance of their, advisor, Eleanor Eiler Shapiro.
kind of randomly opened here.
remains
But it was published by the...
published, but in fact, Nellie Harder underwrote most of the cost of it, took the risk of publishing it. And we see a couple of pictures there. The top one is Miss Harder helping some of the students go through past issues of the paper, seeking out information. And of course, the bottom one is one of Mrs. Shapiro holding a copy of the finished book. Also at this time, the newspaper printed histories of Seville, one that was done by Zola Murray, and one that was done of Sharon Center, also at that time in the 1930s. We mentioned that the building was all decorated for the 1939 125th anniversary celebration. This is the way the banner press covered it. It's several sections there, but filled with pictures and information and history. Mayor Harold Burton on the right-hand side, who was mayor of Cleveland, was to speak at the Sunday night closing sessions. He later went on to become a justice of the United States Supreme Court. Esther Melvin was the queen of that celebration. She reigned over the celebration, and of course was later the wife of our mayor, Dr. Charles Daniels. And this is the way the Wadsworth News covered that same celebration. You can tell it was a big deal at that time.
Yeah.
And the Wadsworth News went into quite a bit of detail, little capsule histories of the different businesses. Now, sometimes you have to take these histories with a little bit of a grain of salt, but basically speaking, they're very, very accurate. You see a picture of the downtown looking down what used to be the High Street Park down through the square, and preparing for that celebration. That's one thing also that we'll have to go into more depth when we talk about doing research on history, is the fact that if you find something in a newspaper clipping and it states a fact, you can't necessarily take that as fact. I've learned that you have to go 2 or 3 weeks beyond that because it could be a mistake. The papers are generally very, very careful about not making mistakes, but mistakes do happen. And just as nowadays most papers like the Beacon Journal will print a corrections box, before you take that as gospel, you want to check ahead and make sure that it's all correct. During the war, we're up to that. During the war, both papers were very active in their support on the home front. The things that were carried on, we can take stop for a moment and take a look at just a few other things. I'm fascinated by how many different subjects they would cover in one newspaper, on the front page alone. Now, this is at the time that the Wadsworth Post Office was built. We're talking about building a new building now. The post office was actually dedicated in May, but in August of 1937, Postmaster General Farley made a tour through this area and stopped at Wadsworth and spoke on the occasion. And this is a paper explaining that event. One thing that I didn't stop to see if it mentions, it probably does maybe on a back page, but in this crowd of people in this beautiful little hometown of Wadsworth, our mayor, H.J. Hall, got his pocket picked while standing in the crowd listening to the speech. They were much more frank in discussing things that happened back then. We think of those days as being more genteel, perhaps, or more prudish, but some of the things that they discussed right on the front page of the paper as far as things that happened were kind of remarkable. In fact, there was, I won't give the name, but there was a man who was despondent over some family troubles and suicided in his home by sitting on a box of dynamite. And they describe in rather explicit detail what Hilliards had to go through, and it was, I think, a lot more than probably the public needed to know. This is December 19th, 1929. Bullets fly as robbers get $12.20 at Markley's restaurant Monday morning.
Oh, Monday morning. Ladies' winter coats, that's a good price.
Why doesn't that look right? Part of that must be missing. Here's an example of what I meant earlier, December 15th, 1921. One headline says, young man burned to death. Another says, schoolboy hit by a car and killed. Rittman man suicides. Oh, good heavens. By the time you're done reading that issue, you'll go out and do harm to yourself. But they covered all of the aspects of life. They covered those sad aspects, like on March 2nd, 1922, when they announced the death of veteran hotel keeper John O'Crider, who was the owner of the Crider House, what later was known as the Park Hotel. He was the father of Dr. William Crider, whose large home was next door to the hotel. And they covered the happy times, like November 2nd, 1939, when there was a Halloween masquerade ball attended by over 500.
Oh, my heavens, 500. Those are elaborate costumes also.
Yes, they are, for that day especially. They covered visiting celebrities, if I can get it open. Like in June 5th of 1930. I don't know if you can recognize that profile or not.
I haven't seen it on the monitor yet. No.
It's Dorothy Fuldheim, who was long known as a commentator on Cleveland TV stations on Channel 5, and she was speaking to the Women's Federation. People going on trips. As I said, they covered everything. This is Dr. Myra Johnson and her sister Kathleen as young ladies when they were on their way to Bermuda for a vacation in June of 1939, just prior to the war. During the war, Della Yoder White, who is still very active, in fact was just recognized for her great work at the library and is active with the Senior Center as well. At that time she was the secretary of the Ohio Match Company, and the Ohio Match, under special contract from the government, had to develop a type of match that could be used in the tropics that wouldn't become damp and not light. And so Mrs. White is demonstrating the fact that they could be placed in a beaker of water and then would still light.
Oh, wow.
This is a, oh, I'm sorry. You just snatched that out of your hand the wrong way. And of course now one of the big topics in town is the building of our new City Hall.
I wondered if you were going to have something on this.
And of course the headline on that one.
Of course this is the original. Well, one of the originals.
Factions split over new City Hall.
Exactly. Okay, well, I have this.
Now, the date on that one was 1935, and of course they did start to build it the next year. They had been trying to build it for some time, and they just, if you remember, our town hall was condemned in 1906, and we didn't get around to building another one until 1936, and it was really through the work, through the efforts of the fire department, who were stuck in an old barn-type building on Broad Street, that we were able to get the building built. And in the interim, they had rented rooms in the old party block on College Street, and then in the Masonic Temple that we'd call the Senior Center, and up above where Picket Fence is now. And I just saw by today's paper the council had authorized the mayor to rent space during the construction down at the waste heat plant, the old injector. That's just a picture of the building under construction.
This is the City Hall?
The current City Hall, right.
Well, yeah, the current City Hall under construction. You know, David, with this picture, though, we're going to have to stop the presses, so to speak, because our time is up. Now, we will have to continue this because we haven't even gotten to where the other names come into play here at the Wadsworth Banner Press. So if you promise to come back next week, we'll finish this.
We will finish it.
Okay.
Then I can find the pictures I couldn't find today.
That's right. All things work out for the best, don't they?
Well, we've talked before. Every time, I always leave the thing that I think I know right where it is until the last minute.
It's not there.
And that's the thing I go crazy trying to find. But as you say, we're not even up to the Second World War yet.
Exactly, exactly. So we're going to stop here. We'll come back. We'll finish up with the journalism history of Wadsworth. And thank you for watching In Touch. Thank you, David.
Thank you.